Welcome. Today I'm going to cover the basic setup of standard accounting on a Samsung Smart UX device. Though I'm showing this on a black and white device, the settings are quite similar and easily transferable to a color device. We start by opening a web browser on a computer or using the SyncThrough app on the device to open the SyncThrough web service. You will notice there are only a few options along the purple banner, which means that you will need to use the login hyperlink in the upper right corner of the page to engage the pop-up form, allowing me to enter the administrative account information for the device. Since Samsung requires you to change the admin password upon setup, I will not be able to share a default password with you, and you will need to have this information to continue. Once the web service updates, you will notice additional options have appeared along the purple banner. To continue, please move your mouse cursor to the security menu and select the user access control item from the menu. The easiest way I have found to configure standard accounting is to work your way from the top of the left frame to the bottom, remembering a couple of terms. Authentication allows access to features and the device, while accounting defines how much resources each user can use. Once you have selected authentication at the top of the left frame, you will see you have a few options to configure. First, we will select how users will authenticate. Basic means you only authenticate when using administrative functions. Device authentication requires you to authenticate to use the device, and application authentication will only present the login screen when a user selects an app that you configure to require authentication. For today's demonstration, we will use device authentication. Please make sure that anytime you change the information, you click Apply in the upper right corner of the frame. Now that we configured how a user will authenticate, let's briefly discuss the different authentication methods you have available. Local and standard accounting will most likely be the two most common methods used, and for this demonstration, the other options will not be discussed. With regards to which method to use, let's go back to an earlier comment I made. Authentication defines which features and devices you can access, while accounting defines how much resources you can use on the device. Since each method has a different intent, you will notice that the login options are slightly different. Let's start by looking at the login options under local authentication. Highlight the radio button to the left of the local authentication setting and select the options button above the grid. On the initial tab, you will see you have several choices. You can configure the device to require ID and password, ID, or PIN code. Under the Method section, you have several password policy settings that allow you to protect the machine from brute force attacks and other unauthorized authentication attempts. You have additional options under the Login Restriction tab that allows you to configure what happens if too many invalid attempts have been made. On the third tab, you have the ability to state how users are logged out. Usually I will configure the logout policy to be no logout, so that users can execute multiple jobs without having to authenticate, and enable the auto logout to ensure if the machine goes idle, a user is logged out automatically. Typically, I have found that a setting between 90 to 180 seconds is appropriate for auto logout. Now that our authentication is configured, we want to exit by selecting Apply and Close. Before moving on, let me show you quickly some of the small differences you have when using standard accounting as your authentication method instead of local authentication. Let's take a look at standard accounting options. First, you will see there is only one tab, and you can decide whether users authenticate via ID and password or ID only. The only other options you have define when you log out, much like what you see under local authentication. You can configure the device to auto log out after each job or based on idle time. If your only intent is to track budgets and not worry about authentication, you can use standard accounting, but most scenarios will be better satisfied by using local authentication. A little later, I will highlight why I feel this way. With that said, let's go ahead and close out of these options and go to the next setting. Ensure you select local authentication and click Apply. Now that we have configured authentication, we are going to move on to authorization. Under Authority Management, we can create group profiles that will allow access to specific functions of the device. As you can see, there are a number of pre-configured profiles. The most common use case for group profiles relates to blocking color usage. Since Samsung doesn't have a pre-configured profile for blocking color, I have already created one. I will edit it now so you can see what kind of options you can define. If I had not already created a profile, you would select Add, but instead we will select the black and white only profile and select Edit. The profile contains a number of options that you can either allow a user to interact with or lock the function from a user. Even though I have a black and white device, you can see the color option. Had this been a color device, there would be more options under color, print, and copy than just mono. Scanning down the list, you can see a number of different options you can either allow or disallow access. Typically, I unlock most options and only lock what is necessary. Make sure to go through these options and ensure that the right options are configured so that your users have access to the tools that they need on the device. Once I have configured the profile, I'm going to select Apply to ensure I save my settings. Let's move to configure budgets under Accounting. I'm going to select Management, enable the Accounting mode, and select Standard Accounting from the list. Under Policy, I can configure when my quotas will automatically reset. There are several options, including daily, weekly, monthly, and manual reset. Additionally, you can decide whose quota stored jobs will count against, the person that's printing or the person that's releasing the print. You'll also have access to recent usage. Finally, you can export count totals. You can also clear the historical data manually if you need to. We will click Apply and move on to the Standard Accounting list. Standard Accounting list is where you would create your budgets. As you can see, I have already created a couple. I will edit one so you can see the different quotas you can configure. Typically, I will select all features and use the Authority Management setting to block access to any features I feel a user shouldn't use. One point I'd like to highlight is the ability to combine print and copy as a single quota, or you can break them apart. Had I had a color machine, you would have the ability to also break out color from black and white. If for some reason you wanted to use Standard Accounting as your authentication method, the section above Quotas is where you would configure ID and password. I'm going to take another second to drive home the point of authentication versus quota. Since Standard Accounting has an accounting ID, it allows you to create either an individual budget or a group budget. In the next step, you will see how we link authentication to accounting. It's important that you understand how you want to account for usage and decide as if it is tracked per user or group. I can link several users to a single accounting ID, so it can get quite confusing if you do not know how you want your reporting to be done, and undoing a mistake can create quite a mess with regards to reporting data. Since I am not making any changes, I will cancel out of the budget and move to the user profiles. I'm going to break my own rule here and create my group first. There are a few groups that are already created for you, but since I'm going to block color usage, I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to name that group and then select the authority profile that I created earlier. One thing to remember, there are requirements when it comes to typing names. You need to make sure that you use valid characters. Now that I created my group, I'm going to select Local Individual and create a new user. This is how I'm going to authenticate as a user. It is important to acknowledge that the user ID is case sensitive. I'm going to enter in the appropriate information into each field, realizing that an asterisk designates a required field. Under Group, I am going to select the group I created in the last step. I will link the accounting ID by selecting Browse, selecting the ID, and then selecting the button that says Select. Once done, I'm going to go ahead and click Apply. Just as a quick recap, we created a user, linked that user to a budget under Accounting, and limited that user's access by putting them into a group that was restricted by their authority profile. Though that may seem complex, the actual mouse clicks and information entered is quite logical as long as we remember to configure from top to bottom. The only other concept that we have to remember is whether we're going to use a group budget or an individual budget. I hope this helps you configure Standard Accounting and helps put some clarity as to what you're trying to achieve. If you have any other questions, please let me know in the comments, and I thank you for your time.